for comes to mind when I think about this upcoming election, because the Republicans are probably going to win, highly likely. Not only will they win the White House, I think they will win back the U.S. Senate, and they will hold on to the House. So I do expect Trump once again to enjoy Republican Congress. The Republicans should be in control of the House and the Senate during the first 2 years of Trump's second administration. Now, whether they're able to hold on to that in the midterms will be a different story. But I think he'll have a long enough coattail to bring in some other Republicans with him. The problem, though, is going to be once they win, because Donald Trump is making a lot of promises that can't be kept. And he's setting the bar much too high. Now, of course, this is the optimism, right? He wants to get elected on an optimistic campaign of hope and and prosperity and American greatness and all that. And people want to vote for positive, right? They don't like to vote for a candidate who's negative or pessimistic. What he's saying is something that's far more likely to get him elected than the truth. I mean, he's being truthful in that he's saying that the economy is really bad. It's actually worse than he realizes, or that he's letting on, because of the phony nature of the bubble. But where Trump is wrong is in his promise of a quick fix. He basically told the nation that if he's elected, inflation is going to go away immediately. All you have to do is elect Trump, and the Biden inflation is going to disappear. No more inflation. The economy is going to boom. Real wages are going to rise. It's going to be a return to, unparalleled prosperity, right? We're going to go from the worst economy ever to the greatest economy ever. And all we need to do to get there is vote for Trump. And he just has to assume office. And just based on, the power of his presence, right? With whatever he's going to do, it's going to instantly transform the economy. Now, maybe people think that, Trump could work miracles because, he's like Moses and has got a staff because God just saved him from that bullet. I don't know. But a lot of bad things have got to happen. And they may happen on Trump's watch. I mean, I could be optimistic about America's best days being in front of us. But if that's going to be true, there's a lot of bad days that are going to be between now and then that are also in front of us. The other saying that comes to mind is no pain, no gain. We have a lot of problems that need to be fixed. And fixing them means pain, means things get worse before they get better. But Trump is not promising that or acknowledging that. He's saying they're just going to get better immediately. And so when he's elected, it's going to be very difficult for him to ask Americans to swallow the bitter tasting medicine that he promised they were never going to taste, that everything was going to be great once he got elected, that inflation was going to go away. It's going to get worse. Inflation is going to be worse in Trump's term than it was in Biden's. Now, it's not necessarily because of what Trump is doing. That's just what was going to happen anyway. Now, had Donald Trump won a second term, or maybe he did win, but he just didn't get the votes officially. But had he served another term, inflation would have reared its head the same, because the inflation chickens were already out there. They just came home to roost on Biden. But some of those chickens had Trump's name on them, right? Trump was part of it. And so inflation problem is going to get much, much worse in the years ahead. Doesn't matter who's going to win. And, if you look at what was talked about. They didn't talk about the debt very often. It was barely mentioned. In fact, of all the conventions that I can recall, the debt was talked about the least. And one of the reasons that Trump couldn't talk about the debt is because he helped run it up, right? So he really can't make the debt an issue when he's part of that problem. But the debt has never been a bigger problem than it is right now, and it's never been discussed as little as it just was. And I'm sure it's not going to be discussed very much at all at the Democratic National Convention that's going to come up in a couple of weeks. And so at the point in time where the debt has never been a bigger problem or more dangerous is when there's the least amount of discussion. And that's not an accident, because nobody wants to discuss it because the problem is so bad. And there is no pain-free solution that the voters can be promised. So everybody just ignore it. Forget about it. Doesn't even matter. Right? There is nothing in this convention about the fact that the country is suffering from decades of excess government spending and excess government regulation. And as a result of that, the economy is a mess. And it's going to take time to repair the damage. But in so doing, rates have to go up. Donald Trump is promising lower interest rates. In fact, he's promising the immediate end of inflation and lower interest rates. How is he going to deliver, what might appear to be mutually exclusive promises? Because if we're going to immediately slash interest rates, how is that going to happen? The Fed's going to have to print more money to do that. The Fed's going to have to increase quantitative easing. That's the only way they're going to get interest rates down. Well, that's going to push inflation up. Right? Trump is promising low interest rates and low inflation. How are we going to get that with all this debt? He's not talking about cutting any government spending. The only thing he talks about is changing where the money is spent. He's not talking about cuts to government spending. He's talking about tax cuts. In fact, one of the things he's talking about is, eliminating the tax on tips for waiters and waitresses, or I guess anybody who gets a tip. So that's going to cost revenue to the government. Now, personally, I agree. I don't think we should tax tips. I don't think tips are income. I think they're a gift. I think I mentioned that on a prior podcast. And when I give a waiter a tip, I don't get a deduction on my taxes. When I have an employee and I pay my employee wages, I get to deduct those wages from my taxes. But when I go to a restaurant and I give somebody a tip, I don't get to write that tip off. I don't deduct that. So the government, the waiter shouldn't have to pay taxes on it. If it's not a deductible expense to the payer, it shouldn't be taxable income to the payee. And again, of course, as I said, when if your job as a waiter, you're supposed to give people good service, whether they tip you or not. So I just think they're gifts, especially, in Vegas, the dealers, right? A lot of people, when you go to Vegas, and they don't even call it a tip, they call it a toke, right? Your token, the dealer. The dealer at a blackjack table isn't going to give you a better hand if you tip him, right? In fact, if he did that, he'd be fired, right? He can't cheat. He's going to deal the cards, and you're going to win or lose. So the tip doesn't give you any better service. The guy that doesn't tip gets the exact same service as the guy that does tip. And so why is the tip income? I mean, it's clearly not. I mean, under the constitutional definition of income. But if they do eliminate the tax on tips, that's just less revenue for the government. How are they going to make it up? I mean, the only tax increase that Trump is proposing are tariffs. And, tariffs are better than income taxes. But a tariff, in order to be really effective, needs to be across the board. You can't simply say, we're going to put the tariff on China, because that doesn't work. What that means is that, Americans will import stuff from other countries and not China if they can do it cheaper based on the tariff. But they're still going to end up paying a higher price than they would have paid had they been able to buy from China. But we're still getting the import, and the government's not getting any revenue because I'm buying a product made in India instead of made in China. What the government needs to do is just have an across-the-board tariff, 10%, 20% on all imports, no matter where they're coming from. That generates more revenue for the government, and that actually is better if your goal is to protect U.S. industry and maybe stimulate U.S. industry by getting more people to buy domestically. See, the problem is right now we've already destroyed most of our U.S. manufacturing. And so the tariffs don't help domestic industries. We still just import. We just pay higher prices for the imports. But I'd rather see the government collect taxes that way than through the income tax. I'd rather get rid of the income tax. Again, remember, the only reason we have an income tax is because the government told the public, we'll get rid of the tariffs if you allow us to tax the rich. Well, the people allowed the government to tax the rich, and as soon as they were able to tax the rich, they hammered the middle class and the poor with taxes that were much higher on their incomes than what they used to be when they were paying taxes on imports. So the country was much better off with tariffs and not an income tax back then, and we'd be a lot better off with tariffs and not an income tax in the future. The problem is we're going to get both. Trump's not going to get rid of the income tax. He just wants to have tariffs in addition to the income tax. But even if he simply makes small cuts to the income tax, it's still, a horrible tax. But the bottom line is spending is going to continue to grow. Nowhere. Nobody talked about entitlements. I didn't hear entitlements mentioned once as far as what are we going to do about the ticking time bomb with Social Security and Medicare and Obamacare. Nothing. None of this stuff was even discussed. And why should they? Why should they bring up any of these issues? All they're going to do is lose votes, right? So you have all the people who are collecting Social Security, Medicare, thinking, yeah, I'm going to vote for Trump because, I don't have to worry. He's not going to cut my benefits. He's not talking about any problems with entitlements, any need to reform them, let alone actually cut them. There wasn't any programs that they talked about eliminating, any departments that they talked about eliminating. A lot of the Democrats wanted to pin this Heritage Foundation 2025 plan, kind of hang it around Trump's neck because they claim it's some, ultra radical, far right, crazy doctrine because it's promising cuts. I mean, they want to eliminate the Department of Education, which would be a good thing. That was part of Ronald Reagan's platform. He wanted to get rid of the Department of Education. He wanted to get rid of the Department of Energy, which we didn't even have until Jimmy Carter. Donald Trump didn't talk about getting rid of any government departments. He did mention returning education to the states. Maybe that means getting rid of the Department of Education. I don't know. He didn't talk about it. But what I've heard them interview, they're talking about taking the money that they were giving to the Department of Education and just giving that money to the states, which instead of just cutting the spending, they just want to redirect it, which may be an improvement over what we have now. But we need to cut government spending, not just figure out a different way to spend the same money or to have other people spend the money. But there was no real talk. In fact, the only agency that I really heard Trump talk about was the Space Force, which he took credit for creating. We got to get rid of the Space Force. We couldn't afford the Space Force when Donald Trump proposed it, and we still can't afford it. We need to get rid of big chunks of the government. Yet there was no discussion at all during this 4-day convention about any government agencies or departments that we could get rid of, that we could abolish. So, yes, while they painted a picture of how bad things are now because of Biden, the idea was everything was great before Biden. Like we had this great economy that Trump had already succeeded in restoring America's greatness. And it was just taken away by Biden. And all we have to do is make the last few years disappear, and we're back to the greatest economy in the history of the country, which isn't the case. The economy is bad now, and it was bad when Trump was president. because he inherited a problem that got worse on his watch because he didn't do anything about the underlying disease. And so we got sicker. And that is what I'm concerned about, because Trump wins and the Republicans are in charge. And what if it finally hits the fan? What if we get the dollar crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, runaway inflation? What if all of this happens early in the Trump term? Then what do we do? What does the nation do? Because now the left is going to say, you see, look what happened. Look at how we put Trump in there. We had this great economy under Biden, and now it's a complete disaster. Inflation's out of control, right? I mean, the whole economy has collapsed. The dollar has collapsed, all because of these ridiculous capitalistic, programs of the radical right, of the hard right. And, now we need Elizabeth Warren or AOC or Bernie Sanders or some type of democratic socialism. We got to get rid of the last vestiges of the evils of capitalism, because look what they've done. That is the risk that we run here by promising so much more than we can deliver, by talking about these pain-free solutions. Now, maybe it's possible that if Trump wins, he can immediately level with the public about the severity of the problem and let them know what has to happen, instead of just continuing to pretend that everything is going to be great because he's the president and that he has the power to make all these problems go away just by drill, baby, drill. Right? That was his whole solution to inflation, was drill more oil. Which, sure, drill more oil, but that's not going to solve the problem that we have. The problems are much deeper than these oil wells. And yes, he promised an immediate end to the wars. I hope he can deliver on that promise. I do believe that had Trump been president, these wars probably wouldn't have started. But once they started, it's a little bit more difficult to quickly get rid of them. But hopefully, if we stop funding the Ukraine and let them know that the money's going to stop, well, then maybe the war will come to an end and he can broker some type of truce that could bring an end to it, which would be a good thing. But a lot of the other economic promises that he made are impossible to keep. And I know that during Trump's first term, there was a lot of optimism that ultimately faded because people thought Trump was going to come in and really cut government spending, balance the budget, because he ran on that. The first time he ran, he was going to shrink government. He was going to, pay down the debt, right? He's not going to do that anymore. He's just talking about growing the economy. If we just grow the economy fast enough, that'll take care of the debt. At this point, that's not even possible. The debt is too big. The debt is growing too much. And interest rates have to go up. One of the ironies of a lot of this is people think that Donald Trump winning is more inflationary than Biden because, he's going to stimulate the economy more with tax cuts. And so we're going to have more inflation. And for that reason, they bid up the dollar. People think the dollar is going to go up under Trump because now the Fed is going to have to raise rates more to fight the higher inflation that's going to come from the stronger growth or whatever they think that the Trump policies are going to result in. But the truth is, if we really are going to have more inflation, that's not bullish for the dollar. That's bearish for the dollar. More inflation, by definition, means dollars buy less. And if the dollar is going to lose more of its purchasing power, that's a reason to sell dollars, not to buy dollars. And the political pressure is going to continue to mount, regardless of the outcome of this election, on the Fed to ease monetary policy, to cut interest rates, to print more money, to relaunch QE, to prop up the economy. Because the unemployment rate is going to go up regardless of the outcome of of this election. That doesn't mean that the nation, is better off sticking with Biden or sticking with Harris, because I think things will get even worse. The problem is the Republicans getting the blame. But I've had these concerns for many election cycles because I keep thinking that it's going to blow up, and we get through another 4 years and it doesn't happen because we keep kicking the can down the road. Well, again, eventually we can't kick it anymore. Somebody is going to get stuck with it, and when it happens, the incumbent and the incumbent party, unfortunately, are going to get the lion's share of the blame for problems that have been built up over not only years, but decades. And both parties have had culpability as far as running up the debt. But it's going to be whoever happens to be at the helm of the ship when